All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Well, my name is Tyler Uffelman, and I'm a threat hunter. And if you're not sure what a threat hunter is, or a blue teamer, or SOC is, you're in the right talk. So to get us kicked off talking about the target audience for this, this is for new and aspiring analysts, particularly blue teamers. If you're not familiar with a blue teamer is, we do the defensive side of security. So when I talk to new and aspiring analysts, I kind of divide security up into three different parts. So there's blue teaming, which is defensive security, so defending networks. You have offensive security, so actively trying to break into things. And then you have risk compliance, legal, that end of things. I'm a blue teamer at heart. I really don't enjoy breaking into things. It's just not my passion. And paperwork and legal is certainly not my passion either. So just a little bit about me. This is a very special year for me. So I came to CircleCityCon for the first time 5 years ago. And at the time, I wasn't working in IT. I was still working on my cybersecurity degree. And early this year, I was actually promoted to senior analyst. And I tell you that so that for those of you who are new and aspiring, you know, if this is what you want to do, put your head down, go to work for a couple of years, and good things can happen. And there's a great community here at CircleCityCon, and I owe great thanks to many people here to have earned being senior analyst early this year. Some other things about me, I do have a certification, CompTIA CySA, which is cybersecurity analyst. Some other background things about me, I do have a master's degree in cybersecurity, and then I'm a published IoT researcher as part of some of that academic work that I did. Also, if anyone ever has questions, feel free to throw up a hand, or there'll be plenty of time at the end for questions as well. So what's the average day like for a SOC analyst? And the fun fact is that no such thing exists, and every day is a little bit different. It has new challenges. In my career, I've worked in two different types of SOCs. So I used to work at an MSSP, which is a managed security service provider. So organizations would pay my company to monitor their network for them. And now I work as an in-house analyst at a company called Allegion based up in Carmel. And there's a key difference between in-house and outsourced. I kind of describe it almost like babysitting. And when you work at an MSSP, you know, you're watching someone else's network. And that's a great service, and I recommend that. And for people looking for jobs, MSSPs are great places to go. But it's kind of like babysitting, that during your shift, you're watching these networks, and you're ultimately going to hand it off to someone else 8 hours later. Whereas when you're in-house, it's yours. And you reap the consequences, whether good or bad, of the decisions that you and your colleagues make. And so you need to be cognizant of that. So talking about blue team mentalities in general, and when I talked about, you know, it's just not my passion breaking into things, well then, what is the mentality of someone who does not enjoy that? Primarily, it's the desire to work in an evidence-based practice. And this is something I don't think we talk about enough in our industry. But a mentor of mine once described IT as being magic to people. And then cybersecurity is black magic. It's all obfuscated and no one really understands it. But I really want to get away from that mindset. And you should be providing evidence to suggest your claims, whatever they may be. Strategizing reasonable defensive measures. So this goes back to what I was saying about MSSP versus in-house. Not always, but in many cases in MSSP, you're going to be doing just a lot of alerting and communicating to your clients afterwards, whereas being in-house, I'm responsible for the configurations. And so I can't just block everything, otherwise we would have business outages, et cetera. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And lastly, and probably most importantly, being a life learner. You're going to have to learn something new every day, and if you're not, you're probably not doing your job as well as you could. So while every day is a little bit different, there are some routine things that we do. So first, investigate traffic from a given source. So you could be looking at traffic that's happening over the network. Maybe it's happening from the individual host themselves. There are going to be lots of various alerting platforms. I have no fewer than 10 alerting platforms where I'm giving evidence from. Now, they might all go to a single place, but there are going to be tens of sources where you're getting that data. Next up, researching threat intelligence, modern security news. So, I mean, based on the stickers that you all received earlier, you should be familiar with a story that's in the media right now. But those things are constant, and the industry is constantly evolving. You'll hear terms like threat landscape is evolving and things like that. And so I recommend having general feeds that you're looking at a couple times a week, just to understand what's changing in the industry. Some other things you'll be doing, working on the blue team, creating reports based on trends, current activity, et cetera. In my case, I generate a monthly report that I then present to the CISO each month. And then I do quarterly town halls for my other infrastructure groups, so server team, network team, et cetera. Remediating a compromised entity post-investigation. So you're going to get an alert, you're going to be looking for some sort of traffic, you're going to determine that it's true positive, and then you're going to take some sort of action after the fact. In most cases, it's going to be one of two things. Either you found compromised passwords, so you're going to issue a password reset, or for the host itself, like a computer, you're likely going to reimage, or there are other techniques you can do to remediate hosts. There will be times in your career that you'll find that you can't remediate a host. Maybe it's a vendor device that you can't touch. It would cost tens of thousands of dollars to get the vendor in. Maybe it's a legacy device that they don't even make anymore. It's not like you can just go buy a new one. So you have to get creative, segment some things, deny outbound traffic, restrict access to the device. Sometimes you have to get really creative. And lastly, probably the thing that I actually do the least is configure and fortify infrastructure. And the reason that is, shouldn't be testing in production, so you have to do a lot of testing. Of course, get proper approval to commit changes, things like that. But you also need to do a lot of background work before you modify a rule, otherwise you could create a business outage. But it's, in terms of configuring and fortifying infrastructure, it could be settings, rules, creating blocks, adjusting allow lists, etc. So I want to talk about examples, some of the tools that we use, and some tools as new and aspiring analysts that I recommend that you get accustomed to. So first, my favorite tool is the SIM. So a SIM is a central solution where you will send all of your logs. And you're going to have lots of various types of logs. So most hosts and environment are going to be Windows devices. So you have Windows event logs, which for anyone who's not familiar, this is something you could go and practice at home, looking at your own Windows event logs. There are free ways that you can forward them, and I recommend getting used to those techniques. You have endpoint protection. Maybe you've heard of this historically as antivirus, but endpoint protection has come a long way from just that yes, no, good, bad style of alerting. Next up, you have your firewalls. Something that I hear from my colleagues a lot is they talk about the firewall. And something that maybe people don't realize is typically there's a firewall at each point of egress. Egress means for your traffic to go out of somewhere. So for most organizations, it's on a site-by-site basis. So wherever you have a physical location, you probably have a firewall going out there, or you might have to tunnel numerous sites together to egress out of one place. But something I hear a lot, and it really bugs me, is the firewall. But for anyone who's saying, well, I don't have a firewall at home, how can I practice this to get some skills so I can get an interview? Well, every Windows device has its own native firewall that you can go create rules with. And I'm not suggesting that because you can make one Windows firewall rule, that you're going to be an engineer tomorrow. But the notion of creating rules, understanding inbound versus outbound, allow versus deny, of course, the order of those rules will greatly serve you throughout your career. Also, one thing I want to note about this is not, I didn't want to assign this some clickbait title, with these 3 things, you're going to be a SOC analyst next year. These are just things that I've found that throughout my career that I've used. I just hired a couple of people on my team, and so I just went through 10 interviews to hire external candidates. And these are the kind of things that I want to see when I'm interviewing someone. Next up, we have our alerting platforms like I discussed. You're going to have a number of sources from where these alerts are coming from. Ideally, you're sending them to one central solution, the SIM, and then responding appropriately to those alerts. Like I suggested before, how I think of where alerts come from, for me, come down to 3 different things. There's the perimeter. So what separates the internet versus your internal network? Traffic over the wire. So looking at your WAN and the entirety of the network space at your organization. and then the endpoints themselves. Next up, you have your threat intelligence platforms. Threat intelligence gets really tricky. It's easy to have a lot of noise, and it can often be not as useful as you would hope, but it's good to have there. And so examples of threat intelligence could be IP-based threat intelligence, domain names, file hashes, etc. And we're going to look at some of these things in a little bit. Of course, your vulnerability management platform, patching is important. And so issuing tickets for devices that are maybe not healthy, not compliant, behind on patches, etc. And the infamous other. So there are lots of other tools that I use on a daily basis, if not a weekly basis, that help supplement these other tools in my job. Probably the most notable one, first Nmap, so scanning an entity to understand what ports are open on it. There's also some vulnerability management content within Nmap as well, but this is something free you can go down from the internet and practice with. PCAP analysis. So a PCAP is a packet capture. A packet is the most individual unit that happens at the network level. So when you are creating a network connection, this is the most individual piece of information that there is. I kind of equate it to like cells in a body. That's the most individual unit there is in biology. And we're going to look at a packet capture here in a little bit. There are numerous malware analysis tools. You could be investigating activity from the host itself, maybe an individual file, network traffic. There's lots of options, and we're going to look at a couple of those in a little bit. Going to grab a quick sip of water here. So I'd like to talk about some examples of threat detection. So I'm sure that we're all familiar with this page. Many of us have seen it before. I would swear that I've signed in this page hundreds, if not thousands of times. We've got a couple different things here. It's kind of hard to see here, but it has the official, 2019 from Microsoft. This is an older slide that I've been using for quite some time, but we've got some other good things in terms of use. Cookies and privacy. I've seen this photo and I've signed into this page, like I said, hundreds if not thousands of times. The reality is this though, is that this screenshot is from domain weightlosshack.ru. And so this is classic phishing. I refer to it as credential harvesting because these guys are looking for passwords. A couple things I want to know about here, especially for new or aspiring analysts. Some terms you should be familiar with. This weight loss hack is called the root domain. And then this piece at the end, this .ru, that stands for .Russia, that's their TLD for their country. A couple things to note about TLDs. They have a really cool history, so I recommend that you read up them later. But there are approximately 1,600 TLDs, and this can be one of the most effective things you can do to defend your organization is to block these TLDs in your DNS filtering platform or at the firewall level, whatever defenses that you have. So I want to talk about quickly this platform. This is urlscan.io. This is a free website that anyone could go to and upload anything they wanted to, and it will take a screenshot of the domain. A couple things to note, you can change what's called the user agent. So a user agent is basically the browser device that you're using. So you could change it to mobile or tablet, for example. One thing to note about urlscan.io is by default, it scans on port 80. And so my point here is that when you look at the protocol, HTTP versus HTTPS. So if you're not getting results, you're saying, hey, I know this is a valid website, like this thing really exists. You might need to specify the HTTPS in front of it. But a great tool that I use quite frequently, I encourage people to take notes. I see a couple of you are. But something to keep in mind about that is distinguishing HTTP versus HTTPS. It will not redirect on its own, in most cases. Of course, you can also change the user agent like I was discussing. I've seen a number of actors who they will specify user agents. If they don't see the exact user agent they want, they'll redirect you to another benign, well-known domain like a Wikipedia or something like that to try and trick us analysts. One thing I want to note about this is the scoring. So in this case, it's correct. I mean, this is classic credential harvesting. We have a Russian web page asking for our Microsoft credentials. However, keep in mind, it is the job of the adversaries to bypass our alerting and to bypass the analysts themselves. And so I encourage you in your careers to look at that score and say, I can understand why they scored it that way, but do not accept it as the truth itself. You will find there's a lot of 0 days that are going to bypass these things, depending on the quality of the sandbox that you're using. Free versus enterprise are going to have different features, so something to keep in mind. My recommendation, especially as I train new analysts, is it's your job as the analyst to interpret the artifacts and not just let everything else do it for you, because if the machines could do it all, none of us would have jobs. So this is classic credential harvesting. You've probably heard a lot about this news, especially recently, given some large organizations who have suffered attacks like these. And something that you can do on your own is just look at your own personal email, see what kind of things are going to the junk folder, upload to the URL scan, and get some good practice. So next up, we have what's called a packet capture, what I was describing earlier. And so in our filter up here at the top, so we're looking for HTTP traffic, so unencrypted browser traffic, and SSL or encrypted traffic. You can tell that in the PCAP in a couple different ways. So looking at the protocol, we see HTTPS versus TLS. Of course, SSL is a little bit older, and so you're likely going to see TLS these days. You can also tell this based on the desk port in most cases, 80 for HTTP or unencrypted web traffic, and then 443 for your encrypted web traffic. These are great things to know in interviews. In virtually every interview I've ever done or conducted, a PCAP has been involved. And this example here is very dear to me. And I'll tell you about that why at the end. So looking at this traffic, we've got a couple things. So first, we can look at our source, and we see this source starts with 10 dot. And for anyone familiar with networking, you know that a 10 dot is going to be an internal IP address. So this is the source, and it's going to an outbound destination. And we know that it's that the destination is not internal because it doesn't have an internal IP address. There are other internal IP addresses, by the way. I encourage you to go do some research for those of you who maybe aren't familiar. But from this first packet, we know that we have internal to external, and then we're going to these domains here. Now, because it's unencrypted, we can get a lot more information. For example, the type of action that is occurring. So you have what's called a GET request, and a GET is quite literally that. You're getting content. So anytime you browse to a web page or maybe you download something, that's called a GET. ProMove, it's always spelled in all caps. That's something to note, especially as you write reports and things. If you're specifying the action, all caps. Now, something else to notice here, because it's not encrypted, we can tell the GET, but also what that action did a GET for. And so we see here WP/content, which stands for WordPress content. This is a WordPress domain. WordPress is what a mentor of mine used to call citizenry web development. So it's very user-friendly web development tools. Think about like the old days for those of you who had a MySpace. I mean, very easy to just kind of plug and go. Now, WordPress itself is, as an organization, is highly legitimate. They host lots of great content on the internet, but you can also get free content, which means that it's easily abused. Keep in mind that hacking is a business. In most cases, hacking is a business, and they have a bottom line too. So they want to use cheap, if not free, tools. So keep that in mind. So we're digging into this just to circle back here. We've got an internal host going outbound to this kendachile.com, and it's doing a GET for some WordPress content. And we look in our path and we see this alphabet soup looking thing here. Now, I'm sure that none of you have ever heard of Kindachile.com in your life, along with this electroenchufe.com, which is also doing a get for some more WordPress content. Again, looking at this path, it starts off something that maybe you recognize, and it goes to this straight up alphabet soup looking thing. And so you as an analyst, we haven't done any scanning, haven't done any threat intelligence, but as an analyst, this should be triggering for you right away, because it's not super common that users are going to unencrypted websites. Can be hit or miss. You've never heard of these domains before. You know that they're getting some WordPress content, and it looks like alphabet soup. Like right off the bat, this should be ringing some alarms for you. Now, immediately after getting that content, we see other outbound connections that are then encrypted, but that's expected. You know, think about it in your browsers, how often you see that little green lock that has a valid certificate. Should be most of the time. But it's interesting that immediately after doing this get, looking down on our PCAP, we then see posting, which is another type of action. I would say in my career, get and post are the most two types of, it's actually called a method when you look in the logs, but it's really kind of the action that's happening. So get and post are going to be the two most frequent methods that you're going to see. And so immediately after doing a get, it begins posting data. And post is exactly what it sounds like. It's posting, it's sending data out. So from the first 10 lines are here of the packets, we see someone downloaded some content, and their device immediately begins sending data out. So without doing any sort of third-party verification, we already know that something here is suspicious. So this actually came from a website called malwaretrafficanalysis.net. I'll say that again, malwaretrafficanalysis.net. I encourage you to look at that. He has a great post all the time, and this is really like modern threat intelligence, what actors are actually doing right now. And that's something that even as a senior analyst, I check out at least a couple times a month to see who the modern actors are and what their tactics are, especially as other things in the industry change. Namely, for anyone not familiar, Microsoft changed their position on macros from the internet. So by default, Office-enabled files with macros that come from the internet will not be able to execute that content by default. And so because of that, actors have to pivot as well. They're not just going to go home, guys. They're going to change their tactics. Now, I think that's a great policy to implement and to honor in your environment. You know, don't undo that policy, but understand that the bad guys are going to change their tactics. My point to saying all that was, if you go to malwaretrafficanalysis.net, this is kind of an older query in the PCAP itself. This program is called Wireshark, by the way. You can go download Wireshark for free, and I encourage you to. The disclaimer with that is you will be intercepting network traffic, so do it in a place where you have permission, otherwise you might be breaking the law. And if you look at newer content on malwaretrafficanalysis.net, he's actually filtering out this SSDP content. That's not really useful. We also see reaching out to, for a Windows update, you will know why it did that here in a moment. But again, we're still continuing to see outbound content after downloading this original content. So like I said, we're in Wireshark, which is a packet capture tool. And right at the very top here, because it's not encrypted, we can tell a couple things about the activity happening in that packet capture. So we see the external domain where this activity is going to, this Kindachile and this electroenchufe.com. And we see the content type is application MS Word. So someone is downloading a Microsoft Word document. Now, something to know about Office documents is that, and Microsoft will tell you this, and a number of their reports, and another stat I use as well is from Verizon, who has a really good incident response team. They will both tell you that 90% of all malware comes in the form of a macro in an Office document. And so Office documents coming from the web are kind of inherently suspicious. The problem is we all use them. So it's very easy for actors to blend in. But if you're seeing this type of activity over the wire in clear text related to domains that you've never heard of ever, inherently suspicious, and then begin posting, Now, there's some other fun things we can do from this, and we can see the file names here. Again, these alphabet soup-looking things. You know, if this were legitimate, we'd expect it to have its own legitimate name, right? Now, just because it has a more legitimate name doesn't, you know, like invoice 12345 or something, that doesn't inherently make it not malicious, but it's something that you should be considering when you're analyzing these artifacts like I was discussing. So since we've observed this content happening over clear text, we can actually carve this out of a PCAP. And why this example is special to me is when I interviewed for my first cybersecurity job ever, I was one of a number of qualified candidates. We all did very well. But and keep in mind at the time, I actually hadn't even finished my degree yet. I was still working on my degree, had about a month left, and I had no experience. But for me, and why I share this story, the difference was that I had this skill, that I could go to a PCAP and I could carve out these files and investigate them. And so despite not having any like quote real world experience, I had a skill that provided value in that moment. And so I hear this argument a lot about, well, how can I get a job if I don't have experience? And you need experience to get the job, and it's kind of this chicken and the egg. And what I have found that's helped me and other people around me is that you have a skill that you can present that provides real value right now. And so for me, it was the ability to investigate Word documents, carve them out of a PCAP and investigate them. So you can actually just like, you can click on it, select it, save it, and then you download it. Keep in mind you should be investigating malicious artifacts in a virtual environment. That way you're not infecting production hosts, things like that. So this is just a screenshot of that, so I've downloaded it. So I did a CD, which is change directory, to where I downloaded it. It's actually desktop, nothing too special there. And then this other thing called an MD5. So an MD5 is a type of file hash. A file hash is, in most cases, a unique identifier for a file. So what you do is you take the binary of a file and you send it through a one-way function, and that gives you an output. That output is called the file hash. An MD5 is an older type of file hash, just based on older algorithms, but it's still valid, still used in the industry. And this is that file name. So the command here, this is on a Mac, by the way. MD5, this is the file name. Remember this alphabet soup-looking thing? And the result is this file hash here. Now, based on this, not really a whole lot I can do. It's not telling me anything on the screen, but now what we can do is pivot. And you will find that pivoting is one of the best things you can do in your career, and that's really what recognizes top-tier analysts versus entry levels. You have some suspicious activity, you have a piece of evidence, you're not sure what to do with it, well, then you pivot to somewhere else. That's exactly what we're going to do in this slide here. So we've taken that file hash and inserted it into a domain called VirusTotal. VirusTotal is an open source threat intelligence platform. And the magic of VirusTotal is this, is they don't actually do a whole lot of investigation themselves. What they do is map it against a bunch of other providers and gives you the collective result of the community. So remember when I was saying that it's the job of the actors to bypass these sorts of controls. This is 10 out of 10 bed of the bone malicious. There's no doubt about this. We can tell it from the PCAP, some of just the other like social aspects of it, file names, things like that, the domains are going to. Yet, 25 out of 60. If you had a 25 out of 60 on an exam, you probably wouldn't be very thrilled. And this is like the security industry at its core right here. And this is why we have SOC Analysts to investigate this type of activity. Now this is a much older fact. This is a much older artifact. But I like the slides, so I continue to use them. And you will still see this type of outcome even today. But you can get the general idea of how other providers would have categorized this, whether they would have quarantined or not, or at least alerted on it if they're in a alert mode. Now, something to note here is that VirusTotal uses a number of external products that it maps against. And I'm trying to find Avast Mobile. So keep this in mind when you're investigating artifacts. This is a Word document intended to be executed on a Windows device. In this case, I know that because after this, it executes some PowerShell. But my point in telling you that is that a mobile scanner is probably not going to give you a verdict for something that's not designed to run on that platform. And vice versa, if you had something that's designed to run on a mobile platform, probably not going to get a result on your typical endpoint providers. A couple other things to note about VirusTotal. This score is great, and like I said, consider why they gave you that score, but there's a lot of other artifacts you can be investigating yourselves. Under these other tabs, so there's details which will tell you more about the file. So we'll tell you if there's any copyright on the file, if the file is signed, who it is signed by. There are a number of other artifacts that you can investigate, pieces of evidence, and this has changed a lot over the years. I mean, even in the last month or so, VirusTotal has changed. There's also the relationships tab. So relationships will tell you when you execute this artifact, what happens? Where does it reach out to on the internet? What kind of things does it do internally? What process does it spawn? Maybe it's interacting with their registry or scheduled tasks or things of that nature. Some of that goes into the behavior as well. There's also a community tab. Again, remember it's community and we're on the internet, so you might be subject to trolls and things like that. In my opinion, VirusTotal does a really good job of cleaning those types of things up, but just keep that in mind. You can sign up for a free VirusTotal account, and it's going to give you a lot more information. There's other rules and detections that they'll show you. And there's just a lot better content if you sign up for an account, which, again, free. Anyone can do this. I highly recommend that you go do this. So that is what I have for you. I wanted to leave plenty of time at the end, though. Especially new aspiring analysts tend to have a lot of questions and any suggestions that I have. I'll give you some more context about me. In the last month or so, my team has expanded quite a bit. So in the last 1 to 2 months, I've conducted about 20 different interviews looking at external candidates. So if you have questions about what type of things I'm looking for, things that have historically helped me in my interview process. Lots of people tend to have questions about academia versus certs versus workforce experience. So I'm open to all kinds of questions, whatever anyone has. Yes? Certainly. I'm really big in the SIM. I'm actually transitioning SIMs right now, and this is my 7th SIM that I've managed. And so first what I would tell you is get familiar with your tools, understand what they're capable of, and maybe more importantly, what they're not capable of. So talking about SIM rules, where to begin? I encourage people to maybe be deliberate about their use of threat intelligence. So when I say threat intelligence, we're usually talking about IP addresses, domain names, or file hashes. And so do you really want an alert every single time someone goes to this type of domain? And you might have some frequent flyers. And understand that there are a lot of benign tools that actors will use. So imagine if you got an alert every time that someone goes to Google Docs or Google Drive. Maybe you don't use that in your internal network, and so you want to know every time someone does. But a lot of that content is going to load on native pages anyhow, especially if someone's logging to their Gmail account. You'll get an alert for that because they sync with those things. So talking about domains, threat intelligence, you got to be very careful there. File hashes tend to be a little bit more consistent, but the thing you need to understand about file hashes, remember when I explained that you're taking the binary and putting it through a one-way algorithm. And so what that means is if you change one bit of that binary, you get a new file hash. So it's kind of like a burner cell phone, one-time use and chuck it. Otherwise, it might start getting detected. Go change a couple bits in that file, and maybe it's not getting detected anymore. Do you have any specific questions about SIM tuning? I don't get paid enough to disclose that publicly. What I would tell you is that I have favorite attributes about SIMs. So first, performance is going to be a big one. I've worked with a lot of SIMs that really chug slowly. And I've worked with SIMs where it takes you 20 minutes to run one query. Now, if you work at an MSSP, that's not going to cut it because you're going to have tens, if not hundreds or thousands of alerts in a day, we can't be running 20 minutes per query. It's just not going to work. There's actually a great sticker on one of the tables. It's like an error message for your queries taking too long to run or something like that. What I would advise people, and this is more of an advanced thing, but it sounds like you're big into SIMs. What I would primarily advise you to alert on is behaviors from the endpoints themselves. That's going to be the most rich data because you can go to that host and see what's actually happening on it. The process is running, register keys, schedule tasks, all that good stuff. And one of the best things you can do, I think it's event code 4688, which is a new process spawned, or a new process created. And in that Windows event log, if you have it enabled, it will show you the command line arguments. And so, like, let's take PowerShell, for example. So PowerShell as a process was created, and you can see the arguments that were run in that PowerShell script. That is one of the most rich things you can do. Going back to this file here, I didn't show it, but in this file, upon executing the macros in that file, it launches base64 encoded PowerShell. Something to just note, especially for new folks, get used to two types of data encoding, not encryption, but encoding, base64 and hex encoding. There are tons of free tools online that you can use to decode those artifacts, and it will show you in ASCII or plain readable human text what's actually happening. Another tactic you will see by adversaries is base64 encoded images. So like, now this case goes to a domain, but I, in my career, have seen a lot of files that they will send you a .htm, which is that HTML code file, and a user will open it. And they'll put the credentials into that HTML file locally, and then it will post out to the internet. I see a lot of cases of base64 encoding of the code itself in the file, hex, but they will also base64 encode the images too. And there's tons of free tools online, base64 code to image, Google it, some good stuff will come up. What are the kind of questions that are out there? Yes, sir. So in academia, there's a technique called like hash collision or something like that, where you can, we'll call it spoofing a hash. Outside of academia, I've never seen that. Something else that I see in academia a lot when I was working on my academia work is talking about steganography, which is basically putting code inside of like a PNG or something like that. Did a bunch of labs on it 5 years ago when I was still in school. I've read about them on other reports from highly legitimate vendors, but I have never encountered a case of steganography in the wild. Going back to like what I was saying, there's a report from early this year, when Microsoft puts out annual reports, where they'll straight up tell you that macro-enabled Word documents account for 90% of all malware ever. So wind the clock back 6 months before macros from the internet were blocked by default. This was 90% of the game. This is 90% of the malware out there. There's been a lot of pivoting to other techniques. So something that I saw, especially early on in COVID, is that I know we're blue teamers, or we want to be blue teamers one day, but just for a moment, put yourselves in the mindset of the hackers. When you want to compromise something, you typically want the entire organization, not just one host, right? So let's say you're a ransomware actor. You're going to want to hit as many hosts as possible to make it hurt as much as possible. Because if you only encrypt one device, I can tell you right now, if only one device on my network gets encrypted, there's this YouTube channel out there, Will It Blend? And this guy just puts all kinds of stuff in blenders and see if it'll blend. I promise you, if I have one device get encrypted, that device is going to Blender, and I'm buying the first round. We'll go out to that night. But as an adversary, you're going to want to hit whole percentage or fractions or everything in that network that you possibly can. And so I'm telling you all these things to circle back that something I noticed early on in COVID was the transition from malware, which is code executing on a host, to getting credentials. It's either going to boil down to code execution or passwords. In like 99% of cases, sure, there's vulnerability exploitation that kind of goes into code executing. Sure. But my point is this, is that I'm seeing a lot more credential harvesting than I am malware. Doesn't mean the malware's gone, but this is the primary tactic that I'm seeing. Keep in mind, there was a report I read earlier this year that, like, according to Microsoft, only 20% of their customers have MFA enabled. So if you can get a password, you're on the network, right? In 80% of the cases, at least according to that one report that I read from Microsoft. So keep that in mind, and that's why MFA is so important. And for those of you who maybe have access to, legitimately have access to an enterprise environment, and you're leveraging Azure in the cloud, there are all kinds of great conditional access rules that you can write based on geolocation. There are lots of other conditions you can write so that even if someone has a password out there, let's say they even got past MFA, maybe you're denying based on location, and that could really save you. Because otherwise, you might be allowing all traffic regardless of location. And so it's important to understand your business because maybe you shouldn't be allowing traffic from some of these hotspots, the Russias, North Koreas. I mean, even in Azure Active Directory, Antarctica is what's called a named location. Like, should you really be accepting logins from Antarctica? Did someone have a hand up over here? I think the guy in the back, and then I'll get you next. Yes, sir. Ooh. That's a really good question, and I'll answer it in one moment. So sandbox evasion. So for anyone not familiar with sandbox, it's a virtual environment where you can investigate types of artifacts. So URL scan is a free sandbox you can use online to investigate network activity. So you could put a domain or an IP address in there, but like you couldn't upload a file to it and see what it does. Now there are other sandboxes where you could upload a file and see what happens when you execute that code. So for me, this comes in two parts. I don't have a percentage, but I would say the artifacts I investigate, for the sake of the conversation, let's say I investigate 100 artifacts a month related to credential harvesting. In my experience, probably 5% have some sort of detection where it would then redirect you to like google.com or Wikipedia. Some of the trolls will redirect you to other naughty places where you shouldn't go in an enterprise network. As far as file evasion, because I don't see as much malware anymore, not that that needs to change. Less than 10%. But what this gentleman's getting at is, maybe there's code written in that file that it will read the operating system type, or it will look for, historic files or things of that nature. And if, in the opinion of the code in that file, it seems like this is a virtual environment, either based on the operating system or, maybe the files have only existed for a day. Well, like no user actually has that, right? So maybe it will read file timestamps, and if it's, newer than 6 months, it's not going to execute this file. As far as percentage, I don't have a great one, but I would say less than 10% of the time. This gentleman, yes. I'm not sure if I understand the question. So what do I see? So like I have colleagues who are red teamers. And you're asking what type of tools they use or what? Gotcha, I'll answer it in two parts. I find that hackers like free stuff because they have a bottom line too. Again, they're running a business and they want to make money. So I found that they're going to use a lot of free stuff. And so you're going to see them pulling down payloads and tools from GitHub. Of course, just good old stuff like Nmap, right? To discover on your environment. You can get Burp Suite for free, which will help you. I found Burp Suite is better at the application level. And that's actually going to lead me to a good point of application versus network. And so you're going to see different actors targeting specific applications versus going after the larger network itself. There are lots of publicly exposed applications because they have to be, right? Maybe that's the service that your organization provides. And so the tools you will see will be specific to app testing, such as like Burp Suite's a really good one, for example. Whereas on an internal network, you're going to see different types of discovery. I don't really deal a whole lot with the app side, but on the network side, the tools have been classic for 5+ years. Looking at the native tools built into Kali Linux, which is another great tool that you guys can all set up and investigate on your own at home. Kali Linux is a Linux distribution that has lots of native offensive tools built into it. So by installing this one operating system, you get tens of tools right out of the gate. You'll see lots of droppers, which is a type of malware. So you download and execute this type of malware, and then it's going to import additional tools to help them pivot throughout your environment. Metasploit's going to be a big one. Good. So at my organization, offensive testing comes in twofold. So there's the product level. I work at a company called Allegion. We make door hardware. So primarily locks, but really everything around the door frame itself. The push bars, the hinges, all that good stuff. And so locks, at the hardware level, there's a lot of picking. You can go to the village and check it out. So we distinguish between the hardware level, which they're using entirely different tools. And that was a big adjustment for me, going from an MSSP, where it was all network all the time, to like, oh my God, someone found a vulnerability in the hardware in one of our locks. And they could go publish this thing online, and people could be breaking the locks all the time. And so that was a huge adjustment for me. On the not hardware side of things, it really comes twofold for us, like I was discussing app versus network. The app side of stuff still tends to be hardware related because we have smart locks that are on the internet. And so the product side of that is kind of on its own team that I collaborate with on occasion, but ultimately that's not something I get super involved, which is because it's the app level. Looking at the network level, something that I've pushed my colleagues to do over the last year is what's called purple team. It's the combination of red team and blue team. So blue team is defensive, defending things, and then red team is offensive, so breaking into things. And we come together twice a month, and what we'll do is the first meeting of the month, we will create a plan for a type of activity that we're going to generate, and then make sure we have the detections for. And then the second meeting of the month, we actually carry out that action. So a more granular example would be, can we detect base64 encoded artifacts in our environment? And so, we'll just whip up a really quick, easy base64 encoded PowerShell script, run it, and make sure that we can see that everywhere in our environment, all of our network zones, and things like that. So that's a deliberate thing that we do twice a month, and then twice a year we have internal environment-wide engagements. So basically kind of like an internal pen test, and the entire network is fair game. Now we'll create a scenario, and we tend to do it based on things that we're seeing in the news. So like a compromised contractor account, or given some of the things we've seen in recent news stories, maybe how personal email can impact our enterprise network, for example. And of course, for not just compliance reasons, but also just good hygiene and practices, we will do an external pen test by a third party once a year. Did that better answer your question? Okay, very cool. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Oh, we're at time? I got 10 minutes. Cool. What other questions are out there? We have 10 minutes. Yes, sir. Gotcha. So first understand the role that you're hiring for, and I'll describe kind of at a high level. My organization distinguishes between engineers, so hardcore, firewall switches, that core infrastructure that makes the bigger machine run, and then threat hunting, so the active process of investigating traffic, setting up alerts, etc. And then compliance as well. So we hired at least one analyst in each one of those departments. And so on the risk and compliance stuff, I mean, you got to know your compliance, SOC 2, SOX, because we're a publicly traded company, et cetera. So don't want to talk a whole lot about that. At the engineering level, I mean, these are the kind of roles that we're asking for like 10 plus years. I mean, you just really got to know your networking inside and out. We have greater than 10,000 employees all around the world, so we got to make sure that stuff works the same in the US as it does in Australia and everywhere in the middle. As for our threat hunters, this is where I really get involved, and this is where I'm at. I distinguish, for me personally, between work experience, academia, and then skills. Just because you've had a job doesn't mean you have any skills. I've seen lots of people in lots of industries who just float by, and sadly, they don't really provide a whole lot of value in some cases. So just because you have 5 or 10 years experience, I'm going to want to see some evidence of that, going back to evidence-based practices. As for skills, I would take someone who has little if no experience, but they can really elaborate on that skill, like I was talking about carving artifacts out of a PCAP. It's something very real that you can discuss in an interview. So I really wait on the candidate to sell themselves and say, this is what I can do, and then I will challenge them on that. Tell me that. So I had someone tell me they're really proficient in offensive testing. I was like, well, let's go. And we didn't pursue this candidate because they weren't familiar with Bloodhound, which is a tool that will enumerate Active Directory, so your internal accounts, groups, etc. They didn't know what Mimikatz was, which is a tool that you can use to carve credentials off of a host itself. It's like, well, what do you mean? Your experience with offensive testing? I mean, so I will challenge you on that, and a good employer will. One trend that I'm seeing right now from a lot of people is they like to discuss their rank in some of the capture the flag platforms, which is great. Those are good skills to have. I encourage everyone to participate in the capture the flag here. There's all kinds of great stuff out on the internet you could be doing on a regular basis. Tear it up. But it all boils down to skills, and that's what I'm going to want to see. So if you come to an interview with me and you tell me that you're top 5% or whatever, and whatever CTF of your choice, I'm going to challenge you on that. And so ultimately what I would tell you is if you're going to advertise yourself as something, have some evidence to back it up and be able to articulate on that. And it's the same with certs as well. I see people who are just the cert masters. They have 10 plus certs. It's like, okay, well, you studied for something. You show that you have that level of competence based on the certification body. Tell me how that can provide value for me right now. Because I know even if you're the smartest cat in the world, there's still going to be adjustments in terms of adjusting to our work culture, adjusting to our business practices. Maybe there's some other compliance and things that you need to get accustomed to as well. And so outside of all that, I know that there's going to be onboarding and training regardless of how skillful you are or aren't. And so keep that in mind as well. And that's why it's important to do research about the organizations to which you're applying. Yep. What other kind of questions are out there? Okay. I'm being told to cut it off, so all right. Thank you all for joining. If everyone has follow-up or questions, please reach out on LinkedIn. I gladly accept a connection, and I look forward to talking to folks who want to reach out. So thank you all.